Here at Millicent Rogers Museum, we are located on the ancestral lands of Tiwa-speaking people known today as the Red Willow people of Taos Pueblo. We strive to deepen our relationship through collaboration and shared responsibility. We acknowledge and honor the complex history of the Red Willow people, past, present, and future generations. We express gratitude to this land and to the Taos Pueblo elders and ancestors who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Welcome. Thank you for coming. So we want to introduce Professor Emeritus J Aigner, who has come to present about his book, The Swastika Motif, which was published in 2018. And there it is right there. Dennis is from the University of California, Irvine, and was recently mentioned in the marquee Who and Who for Lifetime Achievement. So we're very happy to have you here, Dennis. Welcome. Dennis is going to discuss the universal and cross-cultural connection of the swastika motif in various art forms, particularly weavings. This brief history contributes to ongoing dialogue and scholarship with the process of framing and reclaiming a deeply rooted symbol of peace and well-being for diverse groups of people worldwide. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. This is actually my second time here at Millicent Rogers, and I'm very, very pleased that they invited me back. The book was first published in 2018, but went through a second edition in 2021. And that's what we have in the bookstore here at the museum, in case after this thing is over, you're interested in buying a copy of the book. They're available in the museum store. So this is what I'm going to try to accomplish in about an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to invite you to ask questions as we go along, but I'm going to have to manage the time, especially for the remote viewers. So in case things get kind of out of control, I may have to say, well, we'll address that later. So don't be offended if that's what happens to your question, but I'll do my best to answer it succinctly and on point. So here's the outline, and I'm going to do it from this improvised stool. So we're going to go through a lot of topics. But before I get into that, let me just say briefly how I got involved in this, because I'm an academic. My training is in economics and statistics. And I had an academic career that lasted about 45 years in various universities in the Midwest and in California. I went to school at UCLA, and last night they succeeded at beating Arizona in basketball, which was very right. And then I went to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, and started my academic career at the University of Illinois. I spent about 15 years in the Midwest, came back to California, and ended up my career at UC Irvine. My second wife, her parents lived in Santa Fe. And so in the early 1980s, I began coming over to Santa Fe with her to visit her parents. And, you know, I'm kind of an artsy person, so looking at galleries and getting fascinated by Navajo rugs, got interested in that. But at that time in Santa Fe, no gallery would show a rug with a swastika on it. They were there because I found them. They were kind of stashed in the back of the gallery, and you know, you look under, oh, what's that? So anyway, I got interested in the simple question of why did the Navajo weavers use that motif in their weavings? And that started me down this path that I've been on for 35 or 40 years. And those of you who are familiar with the research process even if you're not an academic by profession, as I am, I mean, most people enjoy research. You open a little door, you say, well, okay, what about that? And that leads you to another little question. So you have to open another door. Anyway, these doors have been opening for me for 35 or 40 years now. And I've come from the simple question of why is this symbol in Navajo weavings to the whole cultural history of the symbol. I don't mess around with the Nazis at all. This is all the beautiful history of the swastika prior to the 1930 appropriation by Adolf Hitler. So it's all the prehistory. And what I'm going to try to demonstrate to you is just what a wonderful, positive, beneficent, cosmic symbol this is historically. So that's my kind of educational goal. Let's start at the beginning and talk about, hopefully talk about, this is not working now.
Uh-oh, of course.
What happened? It was working fine.
It's green.
Oh, I don't know what happened.
Maybe you have to stand.
Well, I guess you're just,
Here, I can
you're
advance.
just gonna have to punch it for me.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. In a museum in Ukraine, of all places, is the oldest artifact that anybody seems to be aware of. It's in a museum in a town called Nazin, and they date it 10,000 BC. I'm going to show you a picture of the artifact in just a moment. Then the next major civilization that used it is in old Turkey, Anatolia, the Hassalar civilization. That's dated 5500 before Common Era, BCE. Samara, which is in old Persia, Mesopotamia. The culture itself goes back to 6500 BCE, but the artifact I'm going to show you is dated 4800 BCE, and it's in the Louvre. And then we kind of move into the Bronze Age, and there are many, many examples of swastika things that come out of the cultures in the roughly 3000 BCE time frame. And then we come to the more recent use of it, still before the Christian era, Buddhism, Hinduism. It is the major symbol of the Buddha. It's one of the major symbols of the Hindu religion, and it has never stopped being that ever since its incorporation in those cultures. The Second World War did not stop the Buddhists from displaying the symbol in their temples, for example. Okay, so let me try this again.
Okay.
Was that you or me?
No, that was.
That was me. Good. Okay, so here is the earliest artifact. There's actually a companion to this. It's a carving out of mammoth tusk, mammoth ivory. This is a bracelet, and it's very kind of difficult to see in the photo the way the swastika is displayed, but so I've drawn it for you here. Now, let me just say, to begin with, swastikas come in many shapes and forms. And in my book, this is my youngest daughter, Angela, by the way, my oldest daughter, Annette, is an artist. And so she created all the drawings in the book of many, many different versions of the swastika. But there are, I mean, I have never counted the ones I've seen. I would suppose 150, 200 different versions of the swastika. This basic idea is a cross with some hooks on it. Now those hooks can come in, right? The one you're used to seeing just has a single hook on each end of the cross. This is a little more complicated. The hooks kind of come in on themselves, but I call that a swastika. It's an early version of a swastika. So this again dates 10,000 BC. There's a companion piece in this museum that I haven't shown you a photo of, which is the effigy of a bird, also carved out of mammoth ivory. The bird is kind of a bird in flight, and the underside of the bird is that same design. So there's a companion piece. I'll come back to the bird because it figures more prominently in another part of the story. Here's the Hasalar civilization. Again, this is old Anatolia, old Turkey, and it's an incomplete thing, right? So in 3 of the 4 dimensions of the figure, there's the hook, but in the 4th dimension, there's not. But that's the way this comes from a piece of pottery that was dug up from this civilization. Here's the bowl from the Louvre. There's a companion version of it in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which I just happened to cross. I happened to go to Berlin, went to the Pergamon, and lo and behold, here's another one of these bowls with the swastika in the center. So this is from Samara, S-A-M-A-R-R-A. The culture itself goes back to 6,500 BC. The piece of pottery that we're looking at here is dated somewhere between 4,200 and 4,800 BC. You're probably aware of an astronomer, an American astronomer by the name of Carl Sagan. He really popularized astronomy in America. In 1985, he wrote a book called The Comet. And in that book, he devotes 3 pages to talking about the swastika. Its role in his book is the following. He has drawings of heavenly bodies, cosmic things that were collected by old Chinese astronomers. It dates back to 5,000 BC, these drawings, and there's a collection of them. One of them has a comet tail drawn in it that looks like that. That is to say, the Chinese astronomers saw a comet, and the comet, of course, is just a mass of gas that is circulating and moving, and the tail of it takes a certain shape. This one is one of the ones they recorded from 5,000 BC. And Sagan was interested in the question, which we'll get to in a minute also, why the swastika pops up all over the world in different cultures that never talked to one another. That is, its appearance in those cultures is not explained by trade or migration of people. It simply popped up in those different locations. And I'm going to show you a map that demonstrates how worldwide the swastika was in terms of its independent creation. Sagan says, well, one explanation for why that occurred is these different cultures saw the comet. And they were, of course, even now, are we not moved by seeing pictures of the galaxies and saying, oh my God, what's going on out there? Well, primitive people were moved also. And for them, these were cosmic events. So this comet tail thing had a special significance because it was a cosmic event. Anyway, Sagan hypothesizes in his book that the reason you see it popping up all over the world is because they all saw the same comet. Now it's not doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me just say before we get to that, let me just say a few other things about the earliest history. So the word itself, spelled with a SV, not an SW, swastika, comes from the Sanskrit language. It is the word associated with the symbol. The Sanskrit language, as we know about it, is roughly 2000, 2500 BC, originated in what's now northern Pakistan, the Indus River Valley. So the Indus River runs from Tibet down to the Bay of Bengal, and it is the reason India is called India, is because of the Indus River, I-N-D-U-S. This culture that lived in that area were invaded by a tribe called the Aryans. The Aryans, A-R-Y-A-N, were part of an Indo-European migration that emanated in the Caucasus Mountains region of southern Russia, came down through Old Persia. Some of them stayed there, and some of them went off to this location in the north of Pakistan. And they conquered the native people that were there. Somehow, the blend of language of whatever the Aryans were speaking and whatever the natives were speaking, they were called the Harappa people, became Sanskrit. And within that language is identified this motif called the swastika. That's where it comes from. And its literal translation is well-being. Well-being. Very positive connotation, right? I'll I said I wasn't going to say anything about the Nazis, but I'm going to say just one thing about the Nazis. It was because the symbol was associated with the Aryans that it was adopted by the Nazis. Hitler was fascinated by the Aryans as if they were a noble class of people, a dominant class of people. And even though they didn't look anything like what we were fed during the Second World War of what Hitler's master race was supposed to look like, they didn't look like that at all. Nevertheless, that's why he adopted it, because it was associated with the Aryan people. The Aryans were this noble class, quote, quote, master race, whatever. And that's what Hitler used it, why he used it. Okay, that's the last time I'm going to mention him. So I mentioned Carl Sagan, and there are other famous writers of mythology like Joseph Campbell, who talks about the swastika. And in Joseph Campbell's writings on primitive mythology, he refers to this bird effigy in Mezine with that swastika-like motif on it. And he talks about that as being associated with light and warmth. Again, a positive connotation. Carl Jung mentions it in his collection of archetypal symbols, along with the cross and the circle. The swastika is one of those archetypal symbols, meaning that it pops up in cultures that never talked to one another. So your dreams contain images that were dreamt by primitive people as well. I mean, this is his philosophy. I mean, his hypothesis, Jung's hypothesis, that these archetypal symbols are somehow part of our collective unconscious that's carried through, again, at this higher level of being, spiritual level of being. The swastika is one of those symbols. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about location. This map, come on, just one. This map appeared in a publication by a man named Thomas Wilson, who was at that time in the 1890s, the director of what was called the National Museum of the United States, the precursor to the Smithsonian. Wilson himself as a scholar, was fascinated by the same question that I'm addressing here, and that is, wow, you see all these artifacts that are collected from various historical sites. Different people don't talk to one another. How could that be? Then the swastika is the thing that we're talking about, this particular motif. So Wilson wrote a very, very long essay that was published in 1896, and it dates all the knowledge, all the scholarly knowledge up to the point of 1894 was collected by Wilson and reported in this document published by the National Museum. And these little swastikas, instead of X marks the spot, it's swastika marks the spot, are his locations where he has collected scholarly information, artifacts that contain the symbol in different forms in all these parts of the world. So there's lots of them concentrated over in Europe and the Middle East. You can see that. India, Pakistan, the Indus Valley, East Turkestan, that's there, China. Now we're over into North America, and look at all the swastikas in North America, Central America, South America. These are all places where the swastika appeared as an independent cultural symbol. In China, for example, the swastika is embedded in a circle. We're used to swastikas being embedded in a square, right? Squared off version. Circular version is the Chinese version, and it's called the sun wheel. If you're familiar also with some Chinese screens, carved wooden screens, and other carved stuff in their buildings, you'll also see the swastika as a sort of running pattern, a meandering pattern. Think of something that looks like this, and then superimpose another one on it. And as you go along, a swastika will be the resolution of those connections. In China, it's also part of a Chinese character for the number 10,000, and it stands for infinite life. So it has a very prominent part, a very prominent place in the Chinese culture. In Japan, it's called manji, M-A-N-J-I, and usually, again, appears as part of a meandering pattern rather than a symbol standing alone. In Old Anglo-Saxon, it's called Philfot, F-Y-L-F-O-T, Philfot. In French, it's called croix, cross, gamme. And in Greek, it's called gammadion. The reason being that each of these pieces is like the Greek letter gamma. 4 gammas kind of connected makes a swastika. So they call it gammodion or croix gammée in French. Let's look at a few other examples of this. So there's our standard swastika, number 1. It happens to be facing in a counterclockwise direction. It also can face in the clockwise direction. The Hindu version of the swastika is like that, with a clockwise direction. And then if you have collected any East Indian Hindu stuff in your life, there are little dots in each space here. That's the Hindu version of the swastika. Why you know it comes from that religion, because of the dots. Number 2 is, if you can imagine a connection between a dotted line connecting these pieces back into the center, you'll have something that many people would refer to as a Maltese cross. It's not strictly speaking a Maltese cross, because the true Maltese cross has a little niche out of each bottom piece. That symbol that I'm asking you to visualize is called croix pâté, meaning footed cross. So that's a very common version of it. There's the sun wheel. Number 3 is the sun wheel. Number 5 over there is very much like the symbol from Mezim, only not at an angle, right? So it has the hooks and then they come back on one another. That's called a tetraskelion in Greek. Part of the swastika family, right? This one is kind of interesting, number 7, because number 7, we talk about number 1 as being 4 gammas connected at the center, yielding the swastika. Number 7 is 4 Greek letter tau, T-A-U, that are combined to make the swastika. The tau part is here, right? There's a tau, basically a letter T, but if you could just see through that, you notice that the 4 of them in that kind of orientation creates a swastika. Number 10, the swastika is perhaps hard to discern, but you can see it in the center. If you just focus your attention in the center of that symbol, there's a kind of an angled swastika in there. That's the symbol that occurs in a lot of old Celtic and Viking artifacts. I call that the Celtic swastika. Then this curvy form, number 11, I have one here. See that one? It's like we would call that a pinwheel, probably, right? But it's a curvy swastika. This is called the OGE form. And in common usage, decorative moldings that you might find in your house have this sort of double S shape. Yes.
Is that a cookie mold or what was that?
Oh, this thing?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's a stamp for bread or cookies. Yeah, this comes from India.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is a very famous symbol. The word OG actually has an old English version to it. It has its French version. So it's an old symbol. And these are all various versions of it in that row, right? Curvy swastikas. Now I'm going to move on to a couple of other ideas. So I mentioned at the very outset, in sort of the historical evolution of the symbol, it became the symbol of the Buddha. Buddhism is roughly 500 BC. And here's a Buddha with a swastika on his chest. And I'm going to pass this little one around so you can see a contemporary metal Buddha that you could buy pretty much anywhere in China for a couple of dollars with the swastika on the chest. So it is the main swastika, it is the main symbol of Buddhism, as the cross is the main symbol of Christianity. Of course, they have completely different meanings in that regard, but it is that important, is all I'm trying to convey to you as a symbol. Here's Buddha's feet. If you Google Buddha's feet, you will see either drawings like this one, or you will see photographs of stone carved feet. And you'll notice that each of the toes has a swastika on it. That's the usual look for Buddha's feet. Here's a temple flag from a Buddhist temple from Seoul, Korea. I happened to be there on business for the university at one time on Buddha's birthday, of all things. And I went to this temple, and there were lanterns and flags, and the swastika was all over the place. So I ended up buying a little paper temple flag, and that's this one. So that happens to be from Korea, but it's a Buddhist thing. This is maybe a little difficult to see, so I'll point your attention to right there. This is a rice cauldron from Laos. And you can see that in this version, the swastika, the end of the swastika has a little curved extension. You saw on the map that the swastika was in Africa. So here are some pieces from Ghana. These date from the 1800s, but as far as we know, the symbol goes back to about the 14th century among various tribes in Africa. These are balance weights. They're made of bronze, and they're used for weighing gold. Each of them has a specific pre-specified weight. And so if you're just putting a piece of gold in here, you add these balance weights on this side until they balance and you know how much the gold weighs. It goes well beyond these things in Africa. I have in the book an allusion to costumes from various tribes that use the swastika symbol. It's very common in Central Africa, Western Africa. Okay, got to move along. I think. No, now we're dead.
Okay, hang on.
Just briefly, I want to mention the swastika in Oriental rugs. The reason I think this is important is that the swastika was used as a design motif in various parts of the Middle East and China. This map is hard to, I should have blown it up a little bit. But here's Turkey, or old Turkey, Anatolia. Here's Iraq, here's Iran, Afghanistan, the Caucasus region where much of the weaving occurred that uses the motif. Baluchistan is down here in Pakistan. That's one of the tribal groups that used it a lot. The Bakhtiari, which is physically located in Iran, are also people that used it a lot. East Turkestan, which is now part of China, a lot of the tribes used it there. Mongolia, I mean, it's all over the place in Oriental rugs. Let me just show you a couple of examples. This is from the Caucasus region. The little swastikas, I hope, in the rug. See them there? There's one. There's one. There's one. There's one. There's one. Very common motif. This is from the Caucasus region as well, from Kazakhstan. It's a very famous design called the cloud band design. And you can see the three medallions that make up the rug have stylized swastikas in them. You might say, well, that doesn't really look much like a swastika, but I'm just asking you to kind of open your mind a bit and say, okay, well, it doesn't look like that kind of swastika, but it has the same general construction, although one part is straight, the other part is curvy. It's a swastika-like symbol. Tibet, of course, is one of the Buddhist countries. And in Tibet, the monks in a Buddhist monastery would sit on meditation mats that look like that. This is a very thick mat. It's probably that thick. And the monk would sit in the middle of it. That is, they would sit on the swastika. That's a power symbol for them. In the old tradition of Tibet, a marriage would take place over a period of 2 or 3 days. There would be a special rug that would be woven for the purpose of the bride and the groom sitting together on swastikas. So 2 swastikas in a rug, or sometimes 3, because in that tradition, an old Tibetan tradition, if a man married a woman and he had an unmarried brother, then temporarily his wife would be given to the brother until he got his own wife. So there would be a marriage rug with 3 swastikas on it. Interesting, huh? Yeah. Maybe not interesting. Okay, now for a little bit more of the story. I'm going to have to move this quickly, but I want to get to this part of it, which is about the use of the symbol in Native American arts and crafts. The earliest appearance of the swastika in a Native American artifact in the United States was from a tribe called the Toka Mound people in Tennessee. It's found in some of their artifacts. There's another group called the Hopewell Mound people from Ohio. That goes back to 2000 BC. So it is in our America that far back in terms of Native American cultures. But in terms of its use in Native American crafts, we can start with the Iroquois, a northeastern tribe. It's used by the Iroquois. It's used extensively by the Plains Indians. So this would be Lakota, Comanche, Kansas. So the name of the state of Kansas comes from the Kansa, K-A-N-S-A, Indian tribe. The name of the state of Iowa comes from the Iowa tribe, I-W, sort of I-O-W-A-Y tribe. The Sac Indians were also a Plains tribe. These cultures used the symbol quite extensively. It appears in southwestern baskets, some of which are on display here at the museum, pottery, jewelry, and so on and so forth. So let's just cruise through a few of these. So here's a Comanche beaded pouch with a swastika on one side. Actually, this pouch on the other side has a fleur-de-lis. Yeah, interesting. So this, I'm just going through a couple of Plains tribes. Here's an Apache woman's belt, beaded belt. There's an Apache Oya, of which they have 1 or 2 examples here in this museum. And you can see, among other things, the swastikas running down it, right? Then we have, I'll pass this around. This is Pima from Arizona. And what's interesting about the Pima use is, again, the swastika is in this meandering style. So it's not just a swastika sitting out there in your face. It's part of this connection between two moving patterns where the swastika is sort of the resolution of those two moving patterns. Here's that basket. You can see how the swastika appears again as a resolution of these movements. In terms of pottery, the oldest piece I've seen is this bowl from Mesa Verde, dates 1150 AD CE, with this sort of swastika. So it's sort of a swastika with a hole in the middle of it, something like that.
Like the comet.
Yeah, pretty much like the comet, exactly, the comet version. So this is a real bowl it's been broken and glued back together, but this comes from the Mesa Verde ruins. I had to put this one in just because I'm giving this talk here. You know where Tesuque Pueblo is on the way from Santa Fe up here. In the 20s, they made tourist pieces of these little rain gods. And there are a couple of them that had swastikas on them. This is one of them. So these are just tourist pieces. They have no meaning in the Native American culture that made them, but they're just kind of fascinating. And there's a whole book written on them, which I have in the bibliography of my big book that talks about these little rain gods. The swastika is very popular in the Pacific Northwest. So going up the coast, starting in Washington, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, all the way up to Alaska. There are just a number of tribes. Some of them made totems, some of them made baskets for their own use. This is one called Quinault, which is in Washington State. This is Tlingit, so this is Alaska. A very beautifully made basket, just with the swastikas as the only ornamentation. Of course, we know about Navajo jewelry, and I have a couple of pieces here we can circulate. Very common to go up on the plaza on Saturday or Sunday in Santa Fe and see people selling old pawn jewelry. Here's a little bracelet, very simple, but just a swastika in the center. So the Navajos used it in their jewelry extensively, as well as their blankets. There's a spoon. It's not exactly the same one, but close. The main question I posed at the very outset was, why did the Navajo weavers put it into their blankets and rugs? The simple answer is because the traders asked them to do so. So you know the brief history of the tribe. In 1864, Kit Carson came in with a small contingent of US troops and basically forced the Navajos off of their tribal lands by killing all their sheep and burning all their orchards. And 7,000 of them were marched into Fort Sumner, New Mexico. They lived there for 4 years. Half of them died because of the bad provisions that were given to them. Finally, in 1868, the US government decided this was not working very well. Let's establish a reservation and send them back home, which is what happened. They were also given a new herd of churro sheep, and so their weaving tradition could start again. The other thing that happened is they were now under the responsibility of the US Bureau of Indian Affairs, recently created, who were supposed to manage the reservations. They issued licenses to traders to establish trading posts on the reservation, of which there were many: Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah. The reservation goes up above the Four Corners area to a little bit of Colorado and a little bit of Utah, but primarily it's in Arizona and a little bit of western New Mexico, as you know. The earliest traders that came in were in the 1870s, after the Navajos had come back in 1868, started to raise their sheep and sort of began their weaving tradition again with their native sheep. In the meantime, they had imported commercial yarn from the east coast of the Anglo-America, and also they were taking old woolen garments. Some of them were used by the army, and they would unravel the wool and respin it into usable yarn for making blankets and rugs. They were doing that as their own sheep herds were being replenished and the quality of the wool was becoming good enough to use again. The traders asked them to use the motif in their weavings. It had not appeared in any of their weavings previously. You look at sometimes on Antiques Roadshow, well, right out here in this room out here is what's called a first phase chief's blanket, a horizontal striped blanket that probably dates from the 1850s. I don't know what date there is on that one, but they're very rare. They're in those blankets, there is no example that has a swastika on it. So the swastika motif as a design really came about because the traders wanted the native weavers to use it. Why? Because it was such a popular symbol in Anglo-America. I mentioned that in the original Sanskrit, it means well-being. That became good luck. It became a good luck symbol. And in Anglo-America, after the colonies back in the 1800s, more and more things were being made with that symbol incorporated in them because it was a good luck symbol. Let me show you an example. This is a hooked rug. It dates probably from 1875.
Wow.
How was it made? My mother used to make things like this. You take what I called a gunny sack, a burlap bag, which was the way that they brought coffee and tea and spices into the US. You stretch it across a wooden frame, and then you have a hooking device that allows you to take a piece of yarn, hook it, come up and back down, and make something like this rug. Beautiful, huh? And it was very common to see the swastika in rugs and quilts. I have a couple of quilts in my collection that were made in the late 1800s that have swastikas on them. And there was a company in Chicago called the Ladies Art Company, I think, Ladies Art something, that produced patterns for making quilts, and among them were swastika patterns. So it was really a popular symbol. Here in the picture up here is what's called a cigar felt, and I'm going to pass this one around. When cigars were sold in beautiful wooden boxes in the 20s, turn of the century, they would place a piece of flannel, a decorative print of flannel on top of the cigars. Those are called cigar felts. Many of them had swastika designs in them. There's one, there's another one that I'm passing around to you. It appears on no end of common household objects. This is an iron trivet. So before we had electricity, you took a flat iron, you heated it up on your potbelly stove, and then you ironed your clothes, and you needed some place to put it so it didn't burn anything. You put it on a trivet, and here's a trivet made out of metal that has the swastika as one of its main design elements. Out in California, we grow a lot of oranges, pears, things like that. And here's a company that adopted the swastika as its logo. The Swastika Fruit Company, right? It's actually the Brown Fruit Company, but that's the brand. In my book, I think I have a list of at least 50, maybe more than 50 companies from this era, late 1890s, early 1900s, that adopted the logo of a swastika for their company, and or, as the case of Mr. Brown, one of their products used the swastika as its symbol. It was all over the place. And this is why the traders said, do that, because we can sell stuff that has that motif in it. It's as simple as that. I'll buy your rug, you get the money, you buy a can of peas or whatever you need from my trading post. Gotta move on. I don't have time to really go into the history of Navajo weaving, but I want to draw your attention to a common misunderstanding between the swastika as a motif in Navajo rugs like that one. This is owned by the museum. And what's called the whirling log. Now, because the swastika still has such a negative connotation, it's often called the whirling log, no matter what it is, right? But the whirling log has a special place in Navajo mythology. This is what a whirling log looks like. It comes out of one of the sand paintings that are used in healing and other ceremonies in the Navajo culture. This one happens to be the sand painting that's used in a healing ceremony called the night wave chant. Elders would come in and make that pattern on the floor. They'd lay down a piece of buckskin. They'd use pollen, ground up minerals, flowers, and they would create, very much like a Buddhist mandala is created, a sand painting. One of the many sand paintings that are used in the Navajo culture contains this figure, which is called the whirling log. There's a story behind the figure. The people, the deities in the figure, there are female deities. They're the white ones. So it's a cross, okay? And then it has these deities on the cross pieces. The white ones are female, the dark ones are male. You also have three other main deities in here. The rainbow warrior, calling God, talking God. If this were made on the floor, the open part, which is at the top of this rug, would be pointing east, as are the openings of Navajo houses. The door is pointing east, is open to the east. This is a rug. Until 1925, it was completely taboo for any Navajo weaver. By the way, the weavers in the Navajo culture were all women, or at least they were until that point. Whereas in the Pueblo culture, which predates them and had also a weaving tradition, the weavers were men. But in Navajo culture, the weavers are women. Until 1925, it was completely verboten, not allowed, taboo for any weaver to weave a depiction of a sand painting. However, in 1925, a man weaver by the name of Hosteen Claw, Klah, was persuaded that if he did so, the Anglos were pushing him to make sand painting rugs, that they would never put them on the floor and walk on them. They would just hang them on the wall. Well, of course, that's not necessarily what happened, but anyway, the taboo was broken, and this gentleman and subsequent weavers, for a short period of time, very short period of time, were weaving sand painting rugs. That looks like a swastika. It only looks like a swastika because of the dark male figures out on the end of the cross. If they weren't there, it would just be a cross. There are many depictions of this thing that don't have dark male figures at the end of the cross, and it just looks like a cross. It doesn't look like a swastika. But this has become so convoluted now, and because the swastika still has a negative connotation owing to its adoption by the Nazis and subsequently the white supremacy movement, that it's just not a nice thing to talk about. So if you go on eBay and look under whirling log as a category, you'll see all sorts of swastika stuff. It has nothing to do with the whirling log of the Navajo culture. It's just the politically correct way now of referring to a swastika. But they're very separate things. In the Navajo language, they have different words and phrases to depict the whirling log as opposed to the swastika. Once the swastika became part of Navajo weaving, there was a word, nakonos, that was created to say, that's what that is. We're going to call that nakonos. That's swastika in the Diné language, but it has nothing to do with the whirling log. Okay, onward. Let's do just a brief history of Navajo weaving. Once they got back to the reservation in 1868, they started weaving again. They were weaving blankets for wearing. That's what they wove. The traders, however, not only talked to them about putting the symbol of the swastika, the motif, let me call it a motif, into their rugs, but also they wanted them to weave sturdier floor rugs and not wearing blankets. They were making wearing blankets for their own use and for trading to other tribes. Well, how was that going to be facilitated? We'll get to that in a minute. But so this transitional period of 20 years between 1870 to 1890 is where you have a kind of a hodgepodge of blankets and more sturdy floor rugs appearing that contain the swastika. Here's an example of a transitional period rug. It's early because it has no borders. It's not a bordered rug. It has end stripes, but no border period, okay? Then in 1890, there was a significant drought on the reservation, and the quality of the wool was affected. A lot of sheep died because of that drought, yet they still produced rugs using the native sheep. But the wool was very wet. It had a lot of lanolin in it. It was very heavy. They couldn't get it out in order to produce higher quality rugs. So in the 1890 to roughly 1900 period, we had roughly 10 years where rugs were being sold not by design, but by the pound. So the traders were offering people $10 for, a rug that weighs 30 pounds, even though it didn't necessarily have any wonderful design. Here's an example from that period, which is a kind of a sampler, right? Lots of different motifs going on here. Somebody some weaver did it just to show that they could do it, but it's a very heavy rug, and it comes from this pound period. That drought also encouraged other commercial yarns to come in to the reservation, in particular yarns from mills in Germantown, Pennsylvania. These yarns were much smaller diameter than the native weavers could produce in their own way. And they were beautifully dyed with aniline dyes, very sharp colors. The weavers loved them. And this Germantown period, from about 1890 to roughly 1910, a 20-year period. So we have these things are sort of, several things are going on at the same time. We have the traders trying to get the Navajos to move from wearing blankets to floor rugs, meaning they had to produce a different kind of more sturdy wool, which they could do, but that was happening. Then you have the drought compounding this thing, commercial yarns coming in, the Navajo weavers, some of them never went back to native yarns. They found the Germantown yarns just so wonderful to work with, they never went back. Here's an example of early period, of Germantown samplers. They're called samplers because a weaver, a young weaver in particular, would demonstrate their ability to weave to the trader by weaving one of these small pieces. It's about, maybe 20 by 20, something like that. Here's one. These are Germantown yarns. You can pass it around and just feel how tight this is and sturdy. It has a kind of a hard yarn feel to it, rather than if you went up and touched this thing. This great big rug is all natural dyes. There's nothing artificial about it, and it has a much softer kind of handle to it than the Germantown. A young weaver would just say, look, this is what I can do. And then the trader would say, okay, well, make me a big one. Make me a big rug. I like your work. That's why they were called samplers. They really weren't sold. They just had that purpose. Now, of course, they're very collectible. Here's a floor rug from the early part of the rug period. So this would be 1900-ish, somewhere in there. Very hard wool, lots of swastikas, a plain border. And what's, I think, remarkable about this particular piece is how the dye lot, it's not the gray part of the rug called the field. See how there are different color variants going through this rug. So the weaver is also the person who's producing the wool. And they're either dyeing it or they're carding it, meaning they're taking, like this one is all natural colors. So the way they got that is combining that and the dark brown. That's how they got that color. So they're spinning this and combining it to make these different color variations. And then in this one, you can see that if it weren't for the decorative part of it, it would be a pretty interesting weaving in its own right, a sort of desert thing, you know, with mountains. And I'm perhaps taking more liberty with it than it deserves, but the beautiful orientation of the colors. And that's just, I think, one of my most favorite parts about Navajo weaving is how they've handled the different color varieties in the field. Okay, getting towards the end here. There were a couple of very influential traders on the reservation in the sense that they encouraged their weavers to do the swastika. One was Lorenzo Hubbell, Juan Lorenzo Hubble, who established a trading post in Arizona in a place called Ganado. It's still there. It's run by the National Park Service. Many of you have been there, I'm sure. Hubble's house is there. Hubble's trading post is there. They still have cattle that they run there. It's a wonderful place to visit. Anyway, Hubble had the, pardon me, back up. And the railroad from Chicago to LA, the Santa Fe Railroad. As you know, from being in like Albuquerque, at every major stop of the railroad, they had either a restaurant or some place to get food. And in the bigger stops like Albuquerque, they had also a curio shop where they sold Native American arts and crafts. The buyer for the Fred Harvey Company was at that time headquartered in Chicago. So they got the concession from the railroad to build restaurants, hotels, curio shops, so that whenever the train stopped, which was every so often to put on water, there was a place for the passengers to get out, have some food, buy some stuff, whatever, all along that 2,000 miles between Chicago to LA, kind of the railroad version of Route 66. Well, it turns out that the buyer for the Fred Harvey Company, his name was Herman Schweitzer, he loved swastika rugs. And he worked with Hubble to produce swastika rugs to be in the curio shops run by Fred Harvey Company. So Hubble made a lot of swastika rugs. He also was known for some design elements. Each trader in the reservation, each trading post that had weavers, established a certain kind of style. I'm now going beyond just the swastika. I'm just saying a style of weaving is associated with a particular trading post. Ganado was known for red. Hubble dyed his with an aniline dye, of course. Red was not a natural color. It was, that's a longer story. There was a dye that came out of a bug called cochineal, which was used originally, but was very expensive. So when aniline chemical dyes came in, that's where the red came from. Hubble dyed his red twice, and he got some very interesting dark red colors. This is not necessarily one of them, but you'll also see that there's a purple in here. The border is purple, and the little border on the swastika is purple, and the little dots on the end. This is called something called the Spider Woman effect. It's sometimes on the cross, it's sometimes on the swastika, those little dots. This is a classic one of Hubble's rugs. Yeah, I need your help. It's not working.
Oh, sorry.
Here's another one. This is Germantown. Again, a classic design, just a bunch of swastikas on a red field. But again, if you were to see this rug in person, you'd see that there are many different dye lots of the red going through the field in this. This is not working again. Please advance it. Hubble was known for something called the hollow cross. So you can see this is just a bordered cross with an empty space. He called it the hollow cross. His favorite color combo was this dark red, which is called Ganado red after Hubble. Gray, with many different color variations of the gray. So this is just gray, black, red, and white. That was one of Hubble's favorite combinations. There was another trader in New Mexico, northern New Mexico, at the Crystal Trading Post called John B. Moore. And he also was a favorite, he also favored the swastika as a design element. He produced catalogs, mail order catalogs, one in 1903 and one in 1911. There are reprints of these catalogs available. You can own them. And you can see what he did was he wrote stories about the rugs. He named the weavers, and he put out in the catalog examples of designs that you could order. You could order them in different sizes. You could order them in different weights or quality of wool, and he would mail them to you. These rugs became known as the plate rugs, Plate. And each one has a number. This one happens to be number 9, the storm pattern. This is a famous pattern that is quite ubiquitous across Navajo weaving. It's not just in that part of New Mexico that they weave the storm pattern. It's woven all over the place. So it has a center, which is like the center of the universe or the center of the Navajo culture, that thing. Then the 4 corners are the sacred mountains of the Navajo reservation, connected by lightning bolts. That's the classic storm pattern. And then here you also see other figures like the swastika and what we would call a water bug. That's that little buggy sort of thing, which is kind of a common, both of those are design motifs that you see in Oriental rugs quite frequently. Here's another one of Moore's plate rugs called Plate 22, all natural colors, no dyes whatsoever, with swastikas in the corners and along the side. Here's another one. This is Plate 27. Sometimes there's just a regular swastika in the center. This particular one has this Greek figure called the tetraskelion. That's, again, a classic one of his. Moore produced in the second catalog in 1911 another version of the storm pattern. And you can see that now the swastika has these little, they're called fletchings. They are the feathers on the end of the arrow that allow it to move through the air in a straight trajectory. So that was a sort of improvement. Moore was quite successful, even though the trading post is in the mountains and was very hard to get to in the winter. That's why he used the mail order catalog as a way of succeeding. He had imported a wife from Great Britain, and she and he turned out were raising money fraudulently from people. Give me money so I can help the weavers. This wasn't associated with selling rugs per se. This was getting money that they were going to give to the weavers, but they never gave that to the weavers. And in 1911, the feds were coming after them, and they disappeared. Moore and his wife left in 1911. The trading post lasted for a little time longer and continued weaving these plate rugs, but Moore and his wife left. I don't really have time to go through much else. So there are other trading posts that also incorporated the swastika in their designs. Klagetoh is a trading post that still exists. It's south of Ganado. Two Gray Hills just went out of business. I think just last year it shut down. Here's what, and Totalena is an ongoing enterprise. Still is a running trading post. These are in northern New Mexico. Red Lake and Tuba City are on Highway 160 headed from Cameron toward the Four Corners area. They each produced some swastika rugs. Red Mesa is another one, and Taste Nose posts are up in the Four Corners areas. They still exist as trading posts, and they developed their own styles, some of which contain the swastika. I'll give you just a couple of examples. Here's 2 Gray Hills. These are the only colors that are used in a 2 Gray Hills rug. The weavers in 2 Gray Hills, for whatever reason, would never use red. No red. So these are, some of this is aniline dye. Some of it is, of course, the white is a natural creamy color, the natural color of the sheep. But there's a gold in there, which is an aniline dye. Everything else is a natural color. 2 Gray Hills developed a 4x6 sized rug that has, when you see one, you say, I know where that came from. That came from 2 Gray Hills. Quite a few of them have swastikas in them. Tisnos Post is they developed a style that I would call very oriental. A lot of oriental motifs from oriental rugs are in tis pieces. This is a particularly wonderful one and has a big swastika in the center. Tisno Post is still operating. It's not where it used to be, but it's still an operating post. Okay, my final gasp here before we get to the very end. Lots of things are going on in the 1890s. The drought, commercial yarns, trying to get the weavers to weave floor rugs and not wearing blankets. This just coincidentally was all facilitated in the 1890s by the development of commercial blankets, woolen, with Indian designs. The first company was Joseph Capps and Son from Missouri, and the Pendleton Woolen Mills from Oregon. They were creating very low cost, beautiful blankets for wearing that had Indian designs. The Navajos loved them. They were a lot cheaper to buy than what went into, 3 months of work or more to weave a wearing blanket. So it just so happened at that same time, here was an alternative to wearing blankets. And so the Navajos said, okay, I will buy a Pendleton blanket and I'll weave you a floor rug, no problem. Now they did continue to weave what we would call saddle blankets for their own use. These are small blankets like this. This is not a wearing blanket. This is a horse blanket. It would be folded in half and set over the horse, and you'd see the swastikas sticking out beside the saddle. So they continued to weave these things, but they didn't weave the wearing blankets that they wove before. This is simply a group of companies that ended up producing what was commonly called a trade blanket. So they were purchased by the traders and were sold at the trading posts in exchange for Navajo weavings. I have a couple of black and white photos of Indian men being buried in them. They were so popular, these wearing blankets, that you'd want to be buried in one of them. Oh. Here's one from the Joseph Capps Company. Other companies started weaving commercial blankets made of cotton. The trade blanket was made of wool and was sold to Anglos as well as Indians. So the Indian designs were favored by the Native Americans, but they were sold to everybody. Then companies like Beacon Manufacturing Company in Massachusetts started making cotton wearing blankets. That's that, and that's this. Afterwards, you can come up and feel it. It's a cotton blanket. That's exactly this blanket right here that I have on the table. Okay. In 1940, all the Southwestern tribes got together and signed this declaration saying that they were no longer going to use the swastika in their weavings. I'll let you just read it for a minute. And remember, they used the word, remember the word filthought, the old English word? Well, there it is, filthought. They don't call it a swastika, they call it a filthought. Okay, so they're not going to use it again, starting in 1940. Here's a picture of the signing ceremony that took place in Tucson, Arizona, February the 28th of 1940. I actually have this is a postcard. I think I have a copy of it in my book in color, a postcard. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the story, except for a postscript. And the postscript is that 3 years ago, 2019, I think, yeah, 2019, I usually sell my books at a show called the Old West Show of cowboys and Indians and stuff. This is my friend Dick Spaz. He lives here in Taos. He normally went to that show. This is Kim Martindale over here, who's from California, but he was selling rugs at the show this time too. And at that particular year, 2019, I decided to take this daughter and one of her sisters. They came to the show with me and helped me. And then we went around the reservation to all of those trading posts that I had up there and talked to the traders about the history of the post and the use of the swastika in their weavings. While we were at Ganado, I was in the little rug room where they sell rugs. And here's this beautiful small blanket, big swastikas in it and bats. And it was woven by a young man named Calvin Toney, T-O-N-E-Y, who lives in Chinle, which is right near Canyon de Chelly. He's weaving swastika rugs. I've come across two other younger weavers, one male and one female, who are now using swastikas in their rugs. Because for them, it's a kind of almost a holy symbol. It's not the whirling log, don't get me wrong. And they're not confused about that either. But for them, the swastika is a powerful cosmic symbol, and they're putting it back in their rugs. So it is kind of experiencing a little bit of a renaissance. I had a couple of other things up here that I wanted to show you before I sign off. I talked about Tibet, and I showed you a meditation mat. This is a yak collar. So it goes like that around the collar of the yak. So you know where your yak is. And there you can see the swastikas in that, right? This is from India. It's contemporary. It doesn't have the dots that the Hindu swastika normally would have, but they're still making things with swastikas on them because during the Second World War, neither the Hindu culture nor the Buddhist cultures ever stopped using the swastika. It didn't have that negative connotation for them. I mentioned other places that used swastikas. This is a mola, M-O-L-A. It's an embroidered thing, right? This is all embroidery. That you see them frequently from Guatemala, but this comes from a culture called Kuna, K-U-N-A, which lives on the San Blas Islands, which is part of Panama. And the swastika is the only symbol in their national flag. Always has been, continues to be to this day. And there are many of these beautiful molas that are created by the women in that culture. This is a really cool one. What else do I have to show you? One more thing.
There's some things around.
No, that's okay.
All right.
We saw a Laotian rice cauldron with a swastika on it. In southern China and in the tribal areas of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos are tribes that have used the swastika forever as part of their designs. Usually it's not like that. It's not a swastika like pow in your face. It's usually part of a meandering pattern. So here's a wearing shawl that has the swastika in a meandering pattern. This particular pattern is called Sata Gaya, which is Japanese, but it's the word for this particular pattern. So you can see that there are swastikas kind of as a resolution of the meandering pattern. And this is a very common way to see the swastika in Southeast Asia. I probably have, I don't know, half a dozen different textiles from that part of the world. Some of them are costumes, some of them are wearing apparel like shawls, but that would be a typical way of seeing the swastika in Southeast Asia. I think that's all I have to offer. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention, and we have a couple minutes if you have some questions.
We do, but first I'm going to say something.
Yes, please say.
Thank you so much for presenting and drawing those geographical and cultural intersections for us to have a broader understanding. So what we're going to do actually is we're going to have a little bit of a group tour for those who are interested to go through the jewelry. We've got a few pieces of jewelry in the jewelry galleries, and Michelle, put your hand up, our curator, is going to take the group through there, and then we'll culminate that brief a part of the Earth exhibition. Also, so there might be time for conversation and questions.
Sure.
And Dennis's book is available in the store. He's willing to sign copies of it if people want to purchase that. Also, this particular weaving is in our store, so it's for sale, and if you're interested in that, you can talk to Laura. So that being said, do you want to do Q&A, or do you want to wander and meander and
Let's see if there's some
Sure.
cues, and I'll do some names.
Sure.
Maybe, yes,
The swastika symbol prior to
the traders.
trading.
To the best of my knowledge, that's true. That's all I can say. There's no evidence of it before that time.
Yes, I just wanted to be sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, we were late driving up from Denver, so I apologize, but you may have covered this. How did the Nazis come to choose the swastika as their symbol?
yeah, I did mention that at the beginning. So can I just tell you that in private?
Later, yeah.
Okay. Other questions, anybody?
I would just like to add something to your question. So that's interesting, and it just got me, your response to her, it got me thinking that to your knowledge, to our knowledge, to anybody's knowledge perhaps. However, it may have been incorporated into sacred materials that we have not ever seen on the market. So we don't know for sure. And the museum is actually, interested in collaborations with the Native people also. So we're kind of trying to open up the conversation around the whole topic, and do some healing and make spaces for conversation.
Main message
It's not in the
there
code
is
style.
that the whirling log and the swastika are completely different things.
Right.
The whirling log existed in the culture in those early days before the traders showed up, but this was only a private healing ceremony. If many Navajos would never have gone to such a ceremony, would not even be aware of the whirling log as a symbol.
Mhm.
And as I said, it's only because of that particular way of coloring the deities that are out at the end of the cross. The whirling log is really about a whirling log. It's about a young man who is estranged from his tribe. He goes to the river, the La Plata River. He meets some deities. The deities tell him to crawl into this hollow log, and they launch him into the river, and he goes whirling down the river, down to some other location. They pull him out. They give him a turkey and some beans, and they tell him how to grow food. And that's it, right? So how they depict the deities in connection to the whirling log is really completely subjective and arbitrary. And it only turns out that it looks like that sometimes. Yeah.
And the reason why a lot of Navajo wouldn't even know what the whirling log is because sand paintings didn't last. Sand paintings were.
They destroyed them. Yeah, they destroyed them. So if you weren't part of one of these healing ceremonies, you would never be. I'm the generic you. I'm really talking about a young or an older Navajo weaver. And it was taboo. I mean, it was taboo in the culture to show a sand painting image to any non-Navajo. That simply was not done until this fellow did it in 1925. So I think the evidence is pretty clear that it wasn't, as a motif, it wasn't there, even though the whirling log was in the culture. Anything else? Yeah.
You were mentioning that at the beginning, it was in the Ukraine where this jewelry, what was it?
Yes, it's a bracelet, yeah.
Do you know if there were any, is this part of people living there that were using it especially, or any kind of symbolism of that?
I don't
No.
know whether I think what she's asking is whether it had any cultural significance other than just the design. Now, did it have any cultural significance, or was it simply a design? I do not know the answer to that. In some cultures, in some of the early days, it was a cosmic symbol. It was a sun symbol. It was about the sun and rotation. You know, of course, it has a rotation element to it. So you can understand how it might have been adopted for that kind of meaning in a primitive culture. And in the Hindu culture, it has a real meaning. And if it turns in the clockwise direction, it's associated with the male. And if it turns in the counterclockwise direction, it's associated with the female. In one of the old books I wrote about the China version, the sun wheel, if it turns in the clockwise direction, it means bad luck. And if it turns in the counterclockwise direction, it means good luck. But these are almost anecdotal. I don't really put much stock. Maybe in the Hindu one, I've read more than one account where it talks about the meaning of the direction, but certainly not in here's a Navajo rug, and there it is in both directions. So there's no meaning to it there for sure. Yeah.
With that comment that you said, that people may have seen it in the comment, is that a comment that comes around
Yes.
now and then?
Is it a known comment?
Oh, it's not a known. No, it is. No, it doesn't have a name. I don't know. Oh, and by the way, I didn't show you this. There it is in a Native American basket. This is from Papago or Tohono O'odham tribe, which is on the border of Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. But there it is, that particular swastika. Okay, I think you should go on where Karen's tour.
Well, Michelle will do the tour, but I
Okay.
just want to say, because we do have a few people online, that for our online people, we're going to stop the recording now. So thank you for attending virtually.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I have to mention these people from Denver. This is my stepdaughter, Kristen, and her husband, Rusty. That's a complete surprise to me. I have no